Welcome to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk.
Hey everyone, it's Jenny Lisk, and this is episode 101 of the Widowed Parent Podcast. So I had such a great discussion with Locke, Davidson and Pamela, Sheffield for this episode. So Ann and Pam are educational consultants, and they have a practice called Educational Connections, which is in Portland, Oregon. And don't worry if you're not from Oregon. They actually have extensive experience working with families all over the United States, as well as some outside the U.S. So I really wanted to talk with Ann and Pam today about a topic that can be difficult. And that is, what are some options if your teen is really struggling? If outpatient therapy or other local resources that are available that you've tried just really aren't helping, and you have a teenager or young adult who needs more help of some sort, and you're not really sure what that might be, what the options are, and what that might look like. So you may recall that back in episode 99, when I interviewed Melissa Pierce, she mentioned having worked with Educational Connections. Melissa's also in Oregon, and how much they had helped her figure out how to get some help for her son. So I encourage you to go back and listen to Melissa's story if this is a topic that is relevant for your family. And I also wanted to speak with Ann and Pam about some of the specifics of what they offer and what kinds of support options are available. So some of the topics that we talked about are the types of situations that can lead people to call them for more help, and how they go about determining what kind of help might be appropriate for a teenager in a particular family. We talked about some of the different placement options. It can be hard to know the differences and when different ones are appropriate if you're talking psychiatric hospitals or residential treatment centers, therapeutic boarding schools, wilderness programs. So we talked a little bit about the landscape of some of the options that are available in the space. And we talked about the role of educational consultants in helping a family evaluate and recommend appropriate options. So I hope you enjoy my discussion with Ann Locke Davidson and Pamela Sheffield. I wish I could sit down with each and every one of my listeners and have a cup of coffee and chat and hear about your life and just support each other in any way that we can. Unfortunately, with most of my listeners not being near me in Seattle, that's not really feasible. But now there's a way that you can actually buy me a cup of coffee if you'd like, a virtual cup that is. If you appreciate the show, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/widowedparent and chip in any amount you like. I love coffee, and I will think of you and go and get a cup to enjoy. I'm grateful for every bit of your support, and I'm honored to be doing this work. And if you've appreciated the show, if you've learned something or found the guests interesting or felt a little less alone from listening to these guests, I hope you'll consider buymeacoffee.com/widowedparent. Thank you so much. Now on to the show. My guests today are Ann Davidson and Pam Sheffield of Educational Connections. They are joining us today from Portland, Oregon. Ann and Pam, welcome to the show.
Hi, Jenny. It's lovely to be here.
Hi, thank you for having us, Jenny.
Yeah. Well, I've really been looking forward to talking with you guys today. And let me tell you what I'm thinking about and why I'm so excited to be talking with you guys. Some kids, lots of kids actually, they do great with peer support groups. There are programs in many communities. They run terrific programs, kids of different ages, teens, young adults, parents, grief camps. Some kids do really well with that type of support. Some kids also could benefit from seeing a therapist, either instead of that or in addition to that. Some kids need more than that, more than either of those things, more help than can be provided locally, or more help that can be provided on a kind of outpatient periodic basis. And I think in those cases, parents tend to feel really lost. Mm-hmm. They're probably thinking, well, first of all, how do I know if my kid needs more help? Or if, whatever I'm doing now is fine. And they're probably thinking, well, what other options even are there, right? Because this isn't the kind of thing that parents are usually talking about. It's not the kind of thing you hear about, all the time in your parent chit chats or whatever. So it's a very long way of saying I'm really glad to be talking with you guys today, because you're working squarely in this space of when teens, young adults need more help, quote unquote, and listeners can't see I'm doing air quotes, whatever more means, more than, kind of outpatient or local or what you might think of as the supports you might try first. So let's just jump right in. And I'd like to start with this question, because you guys are education consultants. And my question is, why do people show up at your door? What are some of the common themes or patterns or situations that you're seeing that have people calling you and reaching out for help?
I think, Jenny, I've over the years I've been doing this, I've seen a couple of really broad patterns. And one pattern is pretty obvious, and the second is not so obvious. So the first pattern is what I would describe as an adolescent or a young adult who's acting outward. So they might be like running away or breaking the law or using drugs or yelling and screaming at their parents. Things that you tend to think of more when you think about struggling teens or young adults. I think that's the image that will come to people's minds. But the other type of young person we see so often and more frequently in our practice, particularly with the pandemic, would be an adolescent or young adult who is doing what we describe as acting inward. And that would mean getting stuck in your room, to put it very simply. So you stop participating in the world. You stop going to school. You stop coming to meals with your family. You stop seeing your friends. And that pattern, it's interesting because with that group of young people, for those particular parents, it can take them longer to get to our door because the pattern isn't quite so disruptive. But what will oftentimes be the final straw is the child won't go to therapy anymore, just simply refuses to participate.
Interesting. Okay, you mentioned a number of things there, and I'm thinking as a parent, any one of those things, I might think, well, they're just being a teenager. Well, they're too tired to go to school. Well, you could come up with maybe alternate justifications for any one of those.
Yeah, and I think what's important to know too is that these are the patterns that come to our door, but by the time they come to our door, it's because parents have absolutely started exactly where you're saying, which is if they're not getting out of bed, let's really get to the bottom of that and figure that out. Or if they're really struggling in school, let's see if we can assist them or connect them with some educational assistance or a tutor or help them in that domain. Or maybe we need a therapist change. Maybe they need to connect to a therapist in the first place or a different one, or be in a group like what you were describing earlier. So I think by the time parents come to our door, it's very usually when they've used a lot of what's available to them locally and been given really outstanding professionals who we know and we like very much. And for whatever reason, it just isn't what that student needs or what they're responding to, or sometimes they're so often very hopeless themselves that they don't even believe that they can improve. And so I think when we see a lot of, my child has been through a number of therapists or a number of professionals, and they will say, nothing has worked. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. Sometimes the issue is much more complex than you can tell on the surface. For example, sometimes we have kids who have undiagnosed learning differences or who have mild autism spectrum and hasn't been identified, or any number of things. But sometimes you have a young person who just feels like they're hopeless and not engaging. So I think by the time families come to us, it's really this pattern of we're here because we don't know where else to go. And we're here because we care and love our child and we're terrified and we want them to improve and don't know what else to do. And then it's our job to really assess that and find out, is that true? Are there other options locally that we know of and perhaps this family has not tried yet, which does happen. And sometimes we hear a story and a history and hear all of the professionals and supports that this family has utilized and find that we need to be looking at something in the broader area to try to support them and try to meet this young person's needs. And that feels like a good fit for them.
Interesting. Okay. So you mentioned a number of kind of, maybe you call them red flags there that parents could look out for, like markers, like my kid is withdrawing, my kid is not going to school, my kid is withdrawing from their friends or from the family, that these are maybe some things that would send up an alert in the parent that maybe they do need to look for additional support. Let's talk about so the situation you outlined, and then someone calls you, like, how do you even go about figuring out? Because at this point, the parent is probably like, I'm lost. I don't know what help my kid needs. My kid needs help, but I'm just so lost. How do you guys go about figuring out how to unravel, what they might need?
It's quite a process, Jenny. So the way we always start, and I do think that this makes our firm a little bit unique among educational consulting firms, is we always take a complete social and developmental history from the time of the child's birth, actually up to what's been happening most recently, to get the story of the child. A lot of times those things are actually, the early things are missed or not known by even the local therapist or the psychiatrist because they simply don't have time to delve into that history. And then what we do is we are typically interviewing a lot of people who have known the child. So we're typically talking to the therapist and the psychiatrist in any places where they've been to treatment, but we're also talking to the parent of their best friend or the coach or their teachers or clergy, whoever can talk about the strengths and challenges of the child. And then we get a much better picture of what's going on. And then we also, of course, look at all of the paperwork that they're coming with. In other words, we're really trying to get a sense of who is this young person, in all of their domains, and what might account for what's going on, and maybe what's been missed, like what Pam was alluding to a moment ago. Is there a history of these unexplained struggles in school or social struggles that nobody's been able to quite put their finger on?
Interesting. Okay, yeah. Well, I can see how, especially in complex cases or complex situations, this would really be helpful. Since it does sound quite complex, is this a long process? Do you come back to them and 6 months from now, okay, now I got some ideas for you? How does that part work?
Typically not. Typically our process takes us about, we usually tell families it would take us about 2 weeks to do all of this research gathering.
Wow. That's impressive.
Yeah.
And what if it's a real kind of crisis situation where even 2 weeks isn't going to work?
That's a good question. That happens quite a bit. It's in that situation, what we do, if you're responding to a crisis, oftentimes it's because it's an urgent situation that needs to be responded to immediately. So very often you're talking about, let's get this person in an environment where they can become safe and stable and work through this moment in their life where they maybe are, very often they're a danger to themselves, or in the cases of sometimes young adults, maybe they've had their first psychotic break. And let's get them into a place where they can be safe and we can help them get some stability. So for that kind of placement, there's things that we want to understand about the young person. And we still want to get the history, and we want to talk to people who can give us the information we need about that young person right now in the moment currently, so that we can make that best placement recommendation. And then we still want to gather all of the information that Ann mentioned. We will just do so when the student is in a safe place, and then so that when they're ready, when that crisis is past, and we're looking at what do they need outside of the crisis, because you're still wanting to get help with, there's still the whole story of what happened that led to the crisis and led to that moment. And then after that moment has passed, we still want them to get support with what they need to avoid future crises.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, it's okay. So we still want to gather the information about what that student is like. But to your point, when you're in a crisis, we want to help them respond to it. And then we want to help them respond to what that student needs after the crisis has passed.
Okay. So it sounds like you could triage.
You add something to that?
So Jenny, adding on just a teeny bit to what Pam said, sometimes we can do that within 24 to 48 hours.
Oh, wow.
That first crisis step, because it is, sometimes we're talking about a child who is in imminent danger of their life or of running away or those sorts of things.
Okay. Gotcha. So you could triage an immediate safe first step and then back up and look for what are the right next steps here to work towards some longer term solutions.
Right. Exactly.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. That makes sense. Well, okay. Since we've started to talk about like first steps and second steps and different placements and things, let's kind of back up and talk about the sort of landscape of placement options, because I think for most people who don't have any exposure to this field, probably, prior to maybe this coming up in their families, they might not know what's the difference between a psych hospital and a residential program and a therapeutic boarding school and. So maybe we can just talk a little bit about what each of these are for kind of people to have a basic understanding of when each of these might be something to utilize. So let's start with what psych hospital, what is that?
That's the option I think people are that probably comes to people's minds first when they think about mental health treatment. So that's a situation where the environment is typically locked. There's intensive psychiatric oversight. They're working on medications typically. And really the goal there is usually immediate stabilization. And sometimes in some of the more longer and more sophisticated programs we work with at that level of care, really good assessment. But the goal is really not to do a lot of treatment yet. I mean, you might be starting, but really you're just trying to get the situation stabilized and assessed.
So it's a short term. Are we talking days, weeks, months? What are we talking about?
It depends. In a local psychiatric hospital, you're usually talking days to a week because insurance typically will stop covering. In some of the private options we work with, for example, we have a young woman going to one of these options next week. It's more of a 5 to 6 week process because they're doing a really intensive assessment with a lot of professionals involved. But it's not typically longer than 6 weeks.
Gotcha. Okay. And so then what is a residential treatment program, and how is that different?
A residential treatment program, it can be in different types of physical environments. So for example, in the programs we work with, they're sometimes in a really large home, and are set up with a lot of support inside. So you'll still have staff oversight. You'll still have a lot of therapy that takes place each week. You'll still have individual and group and a lot of therapeutic intervention and supports. So I think it serves the function that a lot of people, this is what a lot of people are looking for. So what Ann said, I think when people hear residential treatment center, I think they think of something that's more of a medical model, psychiatric hospital setting. But in a lot of the places that we work with, kids have, and when I say kids, I mean young adults, I mean adolescents too. But young people usually start out in a higher level of care, getting some stability, and then they move down to a residential treatment center level of care. So in other words, it represents less structure than a psych hospital, but still provides a lot of support and structure and oversight in what a young person needs. And for us, in the programs we work with too, there's an educational component as well. So especially adolescents, they are going to full-time, fully accredited schools. And so they're really participating in the activities that they would be doing at home, but in an environment where there is more wraparound support and care and observation, so that if something happens in the classroom, the therapist is going to know and be able to talk to them and intervene, as opposed to when you're at home and in the world, if something happens in the classroom at your school, unless someone specifically calls your parents or your therapist, nobody's really going to know.
Gotcha. Okay. And so these residential treatment centers, what kind of time frame are we usually talking about, or a range of time frames somebody might be at one of those places?
It varies, and it's very individualized, but the research and what people are reporting is that at some programs it can be, I think, as little as 6 months. And then I think up to 12 to 14 months in some cases is also what we've seen.
Okay. So I wonder, is this more like the therapeutic boarding school type placement? Is that something different?
It's similar, but different in some pretty key ways.
So, Jenny, this is a key point of confusion often, I think, for families. And so a therapeutic boarding school can provide a lot of the things that Pam just alluded to. So you have a full-time accredited school, you have a therapist, you're in groups, and you're participating in recreation. But it's appropriate for a student who can function with a little bit less structure. So I'm going to put it very simplistically, but this is often an image that can help families. The child needs to be able to, you have to have confidence that when the child wakes up in the morning, they will get out of their bed in their dorm and walk across the field or wherever to their classroom or to the main center. Whereas in RTC, a residential treatment center, you do not necessarily have to have that confidence because everything tends to be more in one building. There's more staff there to assist, etc. So if you can almost think in terms of sometimes even the same diagnoses and the same therapy, but a student who can function with a bit less structure. Mm-hmm. And they, interestingly enough, tend to be a little bit longer. So the length of stay at a therapeutic boarding school tends to be 12 months and sometimes up to 18 months, with them steadily dropping the structure over time.
Interesting. Okay. And on the residential, I was a little bit surprised to hear that 6 months might be on the short end. I thought there were some like 30, 60, 90 day kind of programs, and I wonder how those fit into the landscape here.
There typically are not those types of programs within the private sector that we work, unless they're for the purpose of stabilization and assessment and maybe some beginning treatment. So there are some programs we work with that are about 90 days, but usually our clients, by the time they get to us, Jenny, because things have become so difficult, that's simply not enough time. So that would be followed by something else.
Gotcha. Okay. That makes sense.
There's a lot of different options out there. And I think why we want to get a really thorough understanding of the situation is we really want to treat the unique situation of the student, of the family, of their unique characteristics, of their strengths, of their challenges. And sometimes a shorter term option is enough and by enough, I think what I mean is for them to go back to their previous context and be successful and be able to be at home. And I think in some situations, what a young person needs is an opportunity to become stable in one of those options that's 30 or 60 or 90 days. And then one of the benefits of being in a therapeutic boarding school or residential treatment center is they're participating more in their tasks of their life, that they're in a community, they are going to school, they're doing therapy, they're having friendships, they're having a life. And they're doing so in a way where the stressors are added back in, and then they're able to navigate those stressors with support. In other words, you want them to be able to practice what they've learned in that first step, to practice what they need to do to be successful at home in an environment where if they have a slip, if they have a bad day, they have therapists around them, they have staff around them, they have people who are going to reinforce them using what they know how to do to cope and to support themselves.
Makes sense. Okay. So this sounds, because when I hear the words boarding school, I think of, everybody's seen movies where, someone is going, I don't know, Prince William is going to a fancy boarding school in England, or when he was a kid, or, someone's going to a prep school somewhere. And it sounds like this is a very different type of boarding school. Can you give us an example? Like I've heard of Boys Town, and I think that is one of these types of schools that you're talking about. Can you tell us like how does a program like that work? Like what does a kid do day to day? Where do they live?
It completely varies depending on the environment and then the school. So I'm just going to give you a couple of very different types of examples at different levels of care. And I'm not in any way promoting or non-promoting either of these schools, but just to give you an example. So we work with a residential treatment center in Utah called La Europa Academy. And that's located it actually was formerly a bed and breakfast. It's this big, beautiful building. The girls are all in one big building living together, and they share rooms. There's like 4 girls to a room. They come down to a central area for lunch, and then they go across the way to a school building with separate classrooms, moving from class to class. They do tons of art. There's a very wonderful dance program, etc. It's a really an arts emphasis. So, and there's a lot of expressive movement during the day, etc. Then we have a different type of environment that we've worked with a lot over the years named Montana Academy. And that program is located, the address is Marion, Montana. But once you get to Marion, you take a hard right and go over a mountain ridge and drop into this beautiful valley. And it's this gorgeous set of log structures really out in the middle of nowhere. And it's a therapeutic boarding school level of care. And the environment is more like, log cabins and bunks, and even the school itself is a log cabin. And there's the emphasis there is on lots of the wonderful outdoor activities Montana has to offer, as well as fabulous therapy. So all of these things we're thinking about when we're trying to make a match. So in other words, we're not just thinking about the level of care or support, which we've just been talking about, but who is this young person and where will they thrive? Like, do they love to fish? Do they love to dance? Do they love to sing? Are they a snowboarder? Things like that, because we want them to have access to the things that they love and build on their strengths.
That's cool. That makes a lot of sense. Well, this reminds me then of another word that I've heard that I'm guessing maybe comes into account here somewhere, and that's this term, the milieu. Can you tell us what that is and why is that important to think about or consider? How does that come into play?
So the idea of milieu, if you can think of it almost as a therapeutic term that would overlap somewhat with the idea of culture, meaning that when I think of it, I'm thinking about the norms, values, expectations, rules, etc., that undergird the environment in which the child and the adults are moving. So, and this is where things differ so much from going to like an intensive outpatient therapy program or outpatient therapy, because a good residential program of any sort is going to seek to create an ethos that conveys the values and the expectations and the hopes and the dreams that they're hoping that the kids will internalize along with the therapeutic work that they are doing. So, for example, you mentioned Boys Town a few sentences ago, and Boys Town is built upon a model called the teaching family model. And the idea is that for many of the young people who are at Boys Town, they've suffered some sort of grief, loss, or disruption in their childhood, and they need to be re-immersed in a family environment. So their kids are living in small houses with couples who are providing the supervision. They walk, oftentimes several blocks to the school. So they're trying to replicate the family environment as much as possible, and the norms and values that they hope would be taught within the family environment.
Which sounds very different from the large house in Utah where the girls are living in a dorm style environment.
That's correct. Very, very different.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So for example, many times if we have a child who might have some issues that are emanating from adoption or from attachment, an environment like Boys Town can be a much preferable environment to a larger school environment like La Europa, which is the setting I just mentioned. Pam, were you going to add something on to that?
I think a couple things on physical space and on the milieu as well. I think what's really important about the milieu, and for us as consultants, we want to understand that really well, because it goes beyond what a school and a program will tell you about. Here's what kind of therapy we do. Here are the recreational opportunities. Here's the academics. How the milieu is organized and how they think about that is so critical, because it tells us how do the students relate to one another, and how do you relate to them, and how do they feel part of a community, and how do you as a program understand that this is a community of young people and not just you're here to do treatment and then you leave, but that you're part of something. And I think that's really important for students and families to feel when they having their child enroll at a program. And I think it's really important for us to know, how does a program understand the importance of that role themselves for the families that we all serve together.
So I'm wondering then, I'm thinking as a parent, right? I'm going to go on all these websites and they all look great. And they have horses and art and school and therapy and this and this and this. I'm guessing that's where somebody like you guys come into play, because you have both the knowledge of the particular places and the expertise in the subject matter to figure out how to read between the lines and make those matches that may not be obvious just by reading the brochures.
I think that's exactly it. It's, ultimately what you're looking at is marketing materials, and we all have them. And I think marketing is really important to convey what you want to convey to the public. And I think the best programs do so very accurately. And I think that there is always more than just what you can see on the surface, and it necessarily has to be. I think you can't fully convey on a website or just on what you see in the materials where the healing takes place in a program, or what's transformative about a place, or how do you create community, which is a very difficult question to answer. But many programs we work with can answer that very well, and it really is reflected in how the kids feel when they're there, and how they discuss it after they graduate too.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, and I can see how it would be helpful, because as a parent, we're not usually equipped with either the knowledge or the background, in this area, and it's easy to feel overwhelmed, I think.
I think it's extremely easy to feel overwhelmed. especially because if a family is looking into a residential treatment center, into a therapeutic program, it's because there's a crisis going on. It's because there's something extremely difficult and emotionally painful going on. And for any of us who've gone through that, if you're trying to deal with a crisis and also now navigate 300 different websites of 300 different programs and places, and what's a therapeutic boarding school and what's a residential treatment center, and
right.
these all look like they work with my student exactly, how do I choose?
Right.
And trying to do all of that while you're also terrified for your child.
Yeah, right.
Is asking a lot.
Yeah.
Which I think is why we come in, because it's our job to understand these programs and to be the person who's not in crisis to support the family who is.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so before we talk a little more about that, I think there's a couple maybe of types of programs that we haven't covered yet. What's a wilderness program?
So a wilderness program, this is another very interesting thing to be aware of. A lot of times we will use a wilderness program instead of a psychiatric program, if at all possible. In other words, a wilderness program, the ultimate goal there is, again, stabilization and assessment. But in contrast to a psychiatric program, in an outdoor therapeutic program, you're typically, it is outdoors. So you're typically hiking, you're camping, and you're with a small group of typically same gender adolescents. So usually 8 to 9 kids. And a big part of the work there involves not just the standard sorts of talking therapy, but doing physical tasks during the day and the week that will bring out your behavioral patterns. So you can get more treatment done rapidly and quickly in that type of context. But the student who attends there does need to be not eminently suicidal, not actively self-harming, those sorts of things. We tend to like those options a great deal because they fundamentally do define the young person as competent, healthy, and potentially efficacious, because they are so challenging, both emotionally and in terms of day-to-day living.
Okay. And are these just for kids who are already oriented towards camping and hiking? Or what if somebody's like, I live in the city, I hate camping, or I don't like physical activity? Like, do they ever succeed in these? Succeed is the right word, but, find a good fit in these programs? Yeah,
absolutely. It's it happens a lot. Sometimes we've gone out to, because part of our job is to go and visit and be in person at these programs. We've been out in wilderness therapy groups where you have 5 kids who've never left the island of Manhattan in their life. And here they are now in the woods in Colorado and having never done so a day in their life. So it's less about your comfort with being outdoors and more about how do you interact with an experience and respond to being out of your comfort zone and out of your own context.
Gotcha.
And learning new things and being part of a community that where you were struggling in your life, it's going to show up in this context where you have community and you have food and you have shelter and see what emerges now.
Okay. And so now I'm thinking the parent and works together with you guys, and you guys, the adults, all decide, okay, my kid needs to go from Manhattan to the woods of Colorado. And you say to the kid, hello, you're going to the woods of Colorado next week. And the kid's like, no. Right? Like, how does that, what are the practical aspects of this? How does that part work?
So, always, if at all possible, we do want our families to talk to their kids ahead of time and tell them where they're going and ideally take them. Often that's not possible because of what you just said, Jenny, or if they bring it up ahead of time, the child might run away or self-harm or those sorts of things. So, and I know that you talked about this with Melissa Pierce in your interview. Sometimes our families end up using a transportation service. And those are people who really, they're the good ones, because there are ones that are not as strong, but the good ones view themselves as frontline in the therapeutic process. And they come to your home and they basically take the child and explain to the child where they're going, what it's going to be like, etc., and fly with the child on the airplane, or if necessary, drive to the program or the option.
Okay.
For many of our parents, this is the most difficult aspect of the decision. And I think you heard Melissa talk about that in your interview with her.
Yeah, for sure. It's great to know that that is an option, because I think, a parent might be saying, oh my goodness, fine, I found something, but how am I going to get my kid there? I'm going to fly them there and they're going to run away in the airport or something, or, jump out of the car at the rest stop and not come back or something like that.
I think you do have to acknowledge that when you're talking about transport, you are talking about something that I think the public perception of it isn't very positive. And I do think you have to acknowledge that when people have this idea, when they hear about it, it sounds terrifying. And I think what's really important to understand is that for the families that decide to have their child go into a therapeutic program and realize that the only safe way they're going to go is if they have someone professional do that for the families we work with, they come to this decision after a lot of deliberation and trying to go through any other way. They don't have to do that. And that, to Ann's point, not all transportation services are created equal, and some are. They're very, very supportive. They have therapeutic training and backgrounds, and very much understand that their job is to escort this child into starting a journey and starting a process. And how do we do that in a way that's respectful and a way that's kind, and not I think for many people, their perception is, they just sort of take them away in the night out of nowhere, when in reality, the process is much more deliberate and kind than that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for telling us more about that. I have another practical question. This all sounds like it could get quite expensive. I know, Ann, you mentioned that like a psych hospital usually takes insurance, or at least for some amount of time would take insurance. Most of these other things, can insurance sometimes get involved in any of these other options, or are there, scholarship or aid options or creative options, or is it all private pay? You got to have money in the bank, or how does this kind of practical aspect work?
It's complicated. I think the short answer is insurance sometimes.
Okay.
It can be utilized. It really does depend. There is wonderful professionals whose entire job it is to understand insurance and how to help a family use their benefits or work through denials process and work through appeals and do all of that to try to get the care that they need. But I think it really, it's a very common question for our families when they call and they ask about this. And what we really have to say is it depends on so many variables that are just really hard to predict. But sometimes we have, and sometimes we've seen families get a lot of insurance coverage. It's just hard to be able to predict from the outset. And I think, and what's very natural is when you're at the outset of this, you want to know what the financial responsibility is going to be. And I think the hard part for us is to say, this is expensive when it's out of pocket, and insurance may help, and we just couldn't tell you whether or not that will happen. So some programs do have scholarshiping, or they will have, there are some programs that will give scholarship funding to wilderness therapy, for example. Sometimes programs, depending on a lot of circumstances, can offer a reduced rate at times. And I think, but the short answer is, I think there's no guarantees, and yeah, private pay can be very expensive. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like, I mean, unless somebody starts asking the questions and looking into it, maybe they just shouldn't assume there's no options. But it does sound complicated, and okay. Well, thank you. I think it's good to at least understand a little bit about that. Okay, so let's say somebody says, okay, I think I need to explore some of these programs. I know I need help. So this is where I guess you guys are educational consultants. Is that what you call it?
Yes.
So how does someone find an educational consultant? And I mentioned up at the top that you guys are in Portland. Do you only work with Portland families, or do you work with people in other states or countries, or kind of how does somebody engage you or an educational consultant in this process?
So for our firm, we actually work with clients from all around the United States, and also have had a number of clients overseas, including Singapore, many families from that area. So it is possible for us to work across geographic lines, and we do so. I would say actually probably 50% to 70% of our clients are outside the state of Oregon. So okay. I think it's really important for any parent who embarks on this process to know that there are consultants that do take financial kickbacks from schools and programs, and a parent should never hire a consultant who could potentially be in that role. And we are members of an organization called the Independent Educational Consultants Association. That they have a website. You can do a search on that for different kinds of consultants in your area. And that organization has a very strict set of ethical guidelines and standards. So number one, obviously it delineates the need to not ever have a financial relationship with a program. The need to be really, the idea of starting with independent is the critical part of that acronym. They also have a lot of standards as to who can be a member. So you have to have at least a master's degree. You have to have visited a certain number of programs. You have to get a number of recommendations. So I think for any parent who's embarking on this process, they should look for an IECA consultant.
Okay, that's good to know, because my next question was going to be, how do you know if they're taking kickbacks or referral fees? And it sounds like if you start on, and I'll put a link to the association on the show notes, but if you start there, you know you're getting somebody who's vetted and ethical.
Correct.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense. So thank you for sharing that. And I'll be sure to put the link both to the association and, of course, to your firm in the show notes so that people have a good place to start there. Let me ask one more question, because, gosh, I think we could keep talking about this all day. This is such an important topic, but I know we don't have all day. So I did want to ask about the parents' experience in all this, because I think it's difficult, it's scary, it's not probably what you expected for your child when you were thinking about starting a family, or when your kid was a cute little baby, or you're imagining the future. Can you talk a little bit about maybe coping with some of the grief as a parent that you might have for the loss of that future that you maybe imagined or assumed or whatever for your child who's now struggling?
I can start on that. I do think one of the things we often talk with our families about is that this is the death of a dream, of the vision that you had for your child. And of course, for your audience, Jenny, they've been through a grief process often typically already. And here we are again. Right? So, and I think also our families, one of the things we hear from our families, because we do run a parent support group as part of our firm, is that they feel isolated and alone, like they are the only ones, and they feel sometimes a lot of shame that they've in some ways failed as parents. So one of the things that I think we think about a lot in our firm is really talking with our families about both obviously the grief process, but also helping them realize they're not alone, and that there are many families struggling in this way, and it may be swept under the rug. But as soon as they start talking and show up at our parent support group, or even sometimes talking to their neighbors, they realize, oh, I know this person or that person. And I think for our families, it has been really valuable to become part of a group of other families so that they can talk about their journey through this process to reduce the isolation.
Mm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, thank you. And I think, many of my listeners already feel alone as, perhaps the only widowed parents that they know. Mm-hmm. And then when you add then this element as well, feeling alone as the only person maybe with a kid who's struggling to the degree your kid is, I can see how that would really be helpful to have a parent support group of kids who are, families who are in similar situations.
Absolutely. And in our parent group, we sometimes have parents who are there who know each other from other parts of their life and never realized that they have something so unique and special in common.
Right, because nobody's talking about it just in general everyday conversation. Right. Gotcha. Okay.
Right.
Gosh. Okay. Well, let's wrap this up here because this has just been so terrific. I think you guys have given us a lot of really good resources, but also information and context and ways for parents to maybe start thinking about and looking for some help. So let me just ask by way of wrap up, and Pam, we can start with you. If you could say one thing to widowed parents whose teens are struggling, what would you say to them?
I would say you are not alone. You are a wonderful parent, and you deserve care and support.
Okay, well, thank you. And Ann?
I would echo what Pam has just said and add that please try not to blame yourself. Please try to realize that the context that your child is navigating is critical, that it's never one variable that is causing this level of distress, and know that there is also great hope, because there are amazing professionals out there that can sometimes work really almost, I view it as almost a miracle in terms of change.
Yeah. Okay, terrific. Well, I think that is a great place to end. So my guests today are Ann Davidson and Pam Sheffield of Educational Connections in Portland, Oregon. So Pam, where can listeners find you guys if they would like to connect with you and learn more about your work?
You can go to our website, which is educationalconnections.com. There's ways to contact us right there, and anybody who wants to ask us any questions, wants to know more, we're happy to talk to them. Happy to help.
Okay, fantastic. Well, Ann and Pam, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you, Jenny. It was wonderful to be here.
Thank you so much.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Ann Locke Davidson and Pamela Sheffield as much as I did. You can find show notes and all the links at widowedparentpodcast.com. Look for episode 101. And a few resources for you this week. I always like to share a few resources at the end of the show. First of all, tomorrow, so that's August 12th, 2021, Hope Edelman is going to be doing a webinar with the National Alliance for Grieving Children. So you may remember Hope. I interviewed her in episode 86. Terrific discussion. Go and check that out for sure. She wrote a classic book called Motherless Daughters. It was probably like 20 years ago, and it just has become a huge favorite book in the topic of mother loss, and she's a speaker on the topic, has written numerous books, and her most recent book is called The After Grief, and it actually looks at the impacts of grief throughout the lifetime, focusing mostly on after those first immediate time of more acute grief. What is the longer term impact in the years and decades to come? So she's going to be speaking on that topic. It's a free webinar with the National Alliance for Grieving Children. You can sign up at their website, childrengrieve.org, and on the top, look for a menu called events or learning or something and find the webinars. They may have a replay. I'm not sure. So if you're listening to this and August 12th has already passed, check it out. It may be available. And in any case, do be sure to listen to episode 86 and pick up Hope's book, The After Grief. Next up, for your podcast enjoyment, do be sure you check out a podcast from the Dougie Center. It's called Grief Out Loud, and it's hosted by Jenny DeCristofaro. They recently had their 200th episode, and Jen has been hosting this show for a number of years now, more than 5 years. I'm not sure how many years. Lots of terrific guests, lots of interesting interviews, discussions, fantastic, wide-ranging. And so after you finish listening to this episode here, specifically on widowed parents, do check out her podcast, Grief Out Loud, and it is more wide-ranging on grief in general, some of which covers, parenting issues, but also grief more broadly speaking. And finally, for those of you listening who are currently caregivers, I wanted to make sure you guys know about the monthly webinar series, also free, from Mental Health, and that is the organization of Dr. B.J. Miller, who is a hospice and palliative care physician. He does a number of webinars every month. He's doing different things. One thing he does each month, though, he has a caregiving series. And like I said, it's free, and he does some discussion and then opens it up for Q&A and discussion among the participants. So if you are caregiving for someone in your life, or if you know someone who has, pass this on to them, because I do think that it's a terrific resource. And I know, and I'm sure many of you know, that caregiving is hard and it's lonely. And I think that, these kinds of resources, I wish this had existed 6 years ago when I was in the middle of all this. So for all three of these resources, I will put links in the blog post and the email that's going out today so that you can get directly to those. And I don't think I mentioned for the last one, Mental Health. It's METTLE health.com. So if you go there, you can navigate to the monthly series. But like I said, I'll put direct links to each of these resources in this week's email and blog post. So find those on jennylisk.com. Okay, shout out today to my listeners first of all, we seem to have a brand new listener in Vietnam. So if you're listening now, welcome. I'm very glad you're here. I saw some downloads pop up recently from Vietnam, and so we have another new country with more listeners of the podcast. I have a map behind my desk. You may have seen it in the backdrop of a video or something else, where I color in blue each time another country has a new listener, or a new country with listeners where there haven't been listeners before. So I have just colored in Vietnam, and I wanted to say welcome, and also wanted to shout out. There seems to be somebody listening in Russia pretty consistently for a while now, and I'm not sure if I've shouted you out before, so I wanted to say welcome. I'm very glad you're here. I can't tell who any of these listeners are. I can just see, when a country has downloads, those numbers get counted up for me. So, write to me if you want to say hello. I'd love to hear from you. Okay, and speaking of hearing from people, thank you very much for the newest review on iTunes, on Apple Podcasts. There's a new review here from someone called Jules Marr 1973, and I wanted to read it to you guys because this is so great. The title of it is Incredible Resource, and the comments are, I'm so very grateful for this podcast. When my husband was diagnosed, I searched high and low for support and could not find. Now, as a widowed mom of 3, I find every episode to be so incredibly relevant and have very specific advice and information that I need. Thank you for making us realize that we are not alone. So, thank you very much, Jules Marr, 1973. I'm not sure where you are, but I'm very glad that you're here and listening. And thank you so much for taking a few minutes to write your very kind comments on Apple Podcasts. For 2 reasons. First of all, I always love to hear from people and hear what people think and hear what's helpful. It really helps me to keep going, but also to know what's helpful and what resonates and pick topics and things like that. And also, it's actually incredibly helpful. Ratings and reviews are very, very helpful in iTunes to help other widowed parents find the podcast. And I know that there are, sadly, more and more widowed parents these days. There are always new widowed parents all the time, and there are more now with COVID. So I'm hoping that a lot of them will find their way here if they think this would be a helpful resource to them. And so your reviews in iTunes are incredibly helpful in helping the show be found so that it can help other widowed parents like yourself. So thank you to everybody who has left a review, and thank you to Jules Marr 1973. Okay, finally, if you have not picked up my new book yet, Future Widow, check it out. And remember, listeners get a 15% discount on the ebook if you buy directly from me. So if you go to my store, jennylisk.com/ebook, it will take you directly there. And when you check out, use the code LISTENER15, and that's all caps, LISTENER15, for a 15% discount on the ebook. And of course, if you want to buy it in print or from some other retailer, you can find all of the options for that, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, IndieBound, Bookshop.org, etc., at futurewidowbook.com for all your buying options. Okay, as always, thank you for listening, and until next week, keep smiling.
Thank you for listening to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk. Connect with us on social media and at widowedparentpodcast.com.